American moneyman, philosopher and billionaire philanthropist Warren Buffett said, "Only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked." He was talking about business models, how when times are good everyone might seem to be doing okay, but when times turn bad, and there are always bad times, the reckless and bad ideas get woefully exposed. As soon as the virus arrived among us, our democratically elected governments, eagerly abetted by their preferred scientific advisors, threw away all the plans they had had for dealing with a pandemic. Plans laid down after years of preparation and discussion, plans in line with advice from the World Health Organization, and replaced them overnight with tactics lifted straight, I can only assume, from the Chinese Communist Party's big boys book of totalitarian control. All over Europe and the developed West, it was the same. Talk about Plan B. Where had they kept this one hidden, a person might have asked, if questions had been allowed, but they were not. They helped themselves, those elected representatives of the tax-paying, law-abiding public, to powers unprecedented in peacetime, the sort of powers, indeed, that might give dictators and emperors excited dreams. With the craven complicity of the so-called political opposition, they drafted and passed outrageously invasive laws with barely so much as a nod to discussion or debate in Westminster. Before we knew where we were, the old world of taken-for-granted freedom had been papered over with a dystopia. It was around then, though, within weeks of the outbreak starting, and certainly within a few months, that the tide started to go out and the truth began to be revealed, made obvious for those looking the right way. The naked swimmers were clearly to be seen. Long ago now, long ago in terms of policies that have ruined lives, destroyed livelihoods, lethally endangered the health prospects of uncountable numbers of people, and compromised the educations and therefore the hopes and dreams, not to mention the mental health and general well-being of a generation of children. There were all manner of voices saying how wrong it all was. Among them, and worth listening to more than any others in the spectrum of dissenting voices, were those of other scientists, and perhaps most pertinently, medical professionals of unimpeachable expertise and experience, with lifetimes devoted to the treatment and care of respiratory viruses, and battling courageously to be heard. Again and again they sought to highlight and to explain the wrong-headedness of what was being done, allegedly in the name of public health. Always they were shouted down, shamed, ridiculed, humiliated, even ruined professionally for having had the temerity to raise doubts and offer alternative solutions. And of course, our governments did not, absolutely and unequivocally could not have done all this alone. For me, in many ways, worst of all has been the complicity in the reprehensible behaviour indulged in by so much of the mainstream media. If those brand new authoritarian policies were to be effective, then control and manipulation of the media was an absolute necessity. Such cooperation was sought from major channels and outlets. Publication of the oh-so-effective government messaging, some, including me, would call it propaganda, saw hundreds of millions of pounds paid into the coffers of channels and titles. The governments, listening all the while to the psychologists in the nudge unit, decided to fire up the fear train, and the mainstream media were at their side for the duration. We, the people, it was blatantly decided, were to be frightened out of our wits so that governments could have their way with us, all for the greater good. Whatever they wanted us to do, they would use the seemingly unstoppable momentum of the fear train to carry all of us where they wanted us taken. First aboard, like ticket inspectors and guards, were faces made so familiar by their daily appearance in our homes, courtesy of news broadcasts. All aboard went the BBC, Sky, ITV, Channel 4 and the rest. High-profile journalists and all manner of well-kent faces took turns shovelling coal into the firebox, making the train's engine run faster and faster. If the governments were seen to ease up even a little bit on the speed of the hell-for-leather rush, maybe contemplating the reopening of schools for our children, or perhaps letting beleaguered businesses in the hospitality and other sectors even begin to regain lost ground, far less to let heartbroken people hold hands with loved ones, or gather together as extended families to lay them to rest, then the most prominent news providers in the land were instantly and always on the government's backs, demanding faster, 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 more, more, more. 2 years later, and here we are, wherever here actually is. Like many populations around the developed Western world, we've arrived at a destination many of us struggle to recognise. The buildings and streets look the same, right enough, but everything else is altered. Society is riven with divisions between vaxxed and unvaxxed, mask wearers and bare faces, those who were helped financially and those that were hung out to dry. Those divides are deep and feel permanent. Great Britain is £500 billion in debt. It has been estimated that 50,000 people who might by now have had cancers diagnosed and embarked upon treatment are as yet unaware of the awful news coming their way sooner or later. 6 million people await treatment by our NHS. In the past few days here on GB News, we've highlighted the results of a Freedom of Information request made to the Office of National Statistics. Coverage of the reply has been absent from the mainstream media. The ONS was asked how many otherwise healthy people had died in England and Wales of COVID and nothing else. The answer was 17,371 across the 2 years, average age over 82. These figures are comparable, to say the least, with the death toll that might be expected from a typical flu season. All lives matter, including those 17,371, but there are nearly 70 million people in Britain. Around 700,000 of us die every year of all manner of causes. I look at these facts, these figures, and I cannot begin to imagine making sense of what has been done, apparently in the name of public health. Time will surely tell, as I and others have predicted before, that policies followed in these 2 years past will prove to have been the worst policy mistakes in peacetime, perhaps ever. The tide I mentioned earlier, that revealing tide, is receding fast now. More and more naked swimmers, politicians, advisors and journalists among them, are to be seen running for cover behind the sand dunes, clutching at towels as they go. But we can see them. We know who they are. Some of them, more every day, have even had the unmitigated gall to think they could hurriedly get dressed again without anyone noticing, so as to pretend they were never in the water in the first place. Knew it was a grievous mistake all along would be a typical recent statement they might make. Those poor cancer patients and the children, what an awful mess. Goodness me, next thing you know, they'll be asking for forgiveness. Last week, an undersea volcanic eruption sent tsunami waves across the Pacific. More than 80% of the population of the island kingdom of Tonga was affected by the resultant devastation. They had no way to see what was coming their way. I have worried for a while that there's a tsunami of another sort coming our way. We've all seen the disaster movies when the tide suddenly drops away, disappearing over the horizon after some deep impact out at sea, before rushing back as a towering, devastating wave, sweeping all before it. There's still so much we don't know, still so much we're not supposed to talk about, ask questions about. We cannot and will not have for years yet long-term data about either the efficacy or safety of the vaccines. Maybe some among the mainstream media, having seemingly awoken hitherto dormant inquiring minds, will ask some meaningful questions about adverse effects. Is there a link to myocarditis in boys? Things like that. Maybe when talk of a new variant comes along, and it surely will, and the government tries to get us back in our boxes, some of those journalists might join the rest of us in saying never again. Or maybe they won't. Anyway, as I say, the tide is well and truly out now, and the naked swimmers are plain to see. All drama aside, there are consequences coming, a great wave of them. Economy, health, the as yet unmeasured damage to our children, and unanswered questions about which, if any, of our institutions we can trust. What has been done these last 2 years by those we had been encouraged to trust will be hard to forgive and impossible to forget.